There's a price for being the responsible one, but I never thought I'd be the only one paying it. My name is Isabella Miller. From 2,000 miles away in Austin, I'm the silent architect of my family's idyllic life. For 3 years, I've secretly paid the mortgage on their beloved small-town bookstore, pouring nearly $100,000 into a family legacy that has my father's name, but my money. Now they're throwing a huge anniversary party to honor everyone who kept the dream alive. They've asked me to fly home, saying they need me there. I'm clinging to this foolish hope that this time it's for me, not just my bank account. But what happens when the one person paying all the bills is the only one who doesn't get thanked? Here's what happened. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The face of the Henderson Group's CEO, a stern-looking man named Arthur Vance, broke into a rare smile on my screen. The board was unanimous, Ms. Miller. Your vision for the lakeside retreat is precisely the blend of modern sustainability and classic comfort we were looking for. Congratulations! My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of pure, unadulterated triumph. I managed a professional smile, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline singing through my veins. Thank you, Mr. Vance. I'm eager to get started. We finalized the next steps, and with a click, the video call ended, plunging my minimalist Austin apartment into silence. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 3 weeks. I'd done it. A solo commission, my name, my design. I pushed back from my desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering Texas skyline. This was my life, the one I had meticulously designed and built, 2,000 miles away from the rocky shores of Maine. My phone buzzed on the granite countertop, a sharp, insistent vibration that cut through the quiet satisfaction. I glanced at the screen, and the fragile bubble of my victory popped. It was my mother. The text wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a directive. Alex's amp blew during rehearsal. Needs $800 by tomorrow for the big showcase. Sent you the link. That was it. No hi honey, no how are you. Just an invoice delivered with the casual expectation of an answered prayer. I felt the familiar heavy sigh build in my chest as I walked back to my laptop. I closed the architectural rendering software and opened the file that felt more like a ball and chain than a document, a spreadsheet named Family Support. The screen glowed with a grid of my own, making a meticulous ledger of silent sacrifice. Rows and rows of dates, descriptions, and dollar amounts that painted a grim picture. August 2022. Cosign Alex's tour. Van liability, $18,000. Monthly instrument insurance, $75. June 2023. Emergency vet Bill Roberts' dog, $1,250. The list went on, a litany of expenses that were always presented as once-in-a-lifetime emergencies. But the real anchor, the one that pulled me under every month, was hidden under the recurring entry labeled simply bookstore subsidy. For the last 3 years, after a vague story from my father about a bad investment, I had been secretly wiring half the mortgage payment for their home and their beloved local bookstore, Miller's Pages. I clicked the cell at the bottom of the column. The sum total of my support glowed back at me in stark black numbers, $94 and $350. My stomach twisted. The down payment for a house. My own house. The numbers blurred, and for a moment I wasn't in Austin anymore. I was 16, standing behind the worn wooden counter of Miller's Pages, the air thick with the scent of old paper and my father's pipe tobacco. Sunbeams cut through the dusty air, illuminating the swirling moats like tiny galaxies. I was sketching a new layout for the storefront in a worn moleskin notebook, imagining a reading nook here, better lighting there. My father had come up behind me, placing a warm, heavy hand on my shoulder. He'd peered at my drawing and smiled, a genuine proud smile I rarely saw directed at me. "You've always been our rock, Izzy," he'd said, his voice a low rumble. The responsible one. It had felt like the highest praise then. Now it just felt like a life sentence. My phone rang, dragging me back to the present. Mom's name flashed on the screen. I knew the drill. The demanding text was the opening salvo, The syrupy phone call was the cleanup operation designed to smooth over the transaction with a veneer of affection. I answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice was bright, dripping with a manufactured sweetness that always set my teeth on edge. "Isabella, honey. I was just thinking about you." She didn't mention the amp or the $800. Instead, she launched into a breathless description of the bookstore's upcoming 30th anniversary party. "It's going to be a huge community event, Izzy. A real town affair. We're celebrating everyone who has kept this dream alive all these years." My grip tightened on the phone. "It would mean the world to your father and me if you came home." She continued, her voice softening with practiced emotion. "We need you here." There it was. The hook. Not "we want you here," but "we need you here." It was the same phrase she'd used to get me to co-sign the van loan, the same one that preceded every request that was too big to put in a text. A part of me, the logical architect, screamed that it was a trap. But another smaller part, the 16-year-old girl who just wanted her father's proud smile, whispered, "Maybe this time it'll be different. Maybe this time they'll finally see me." Against every rational instinct, that foolish hope took root. I told her I'd check for flights. After we hung up, I pulled up an airline website. The last-minute cross-country tickets were criminally expensive, another unspoken line item for the spreadsheet. My cursor hovered over the confirm purchase button. On my other monitor, the spreadsheet glowed its six-figure total, a silent, screaming warning. My finger trembled as I clicked. The flight was booked. I was going home. Flying into Portland and driving the coast, the familiar salt-scoured air did nothing to calm the knot in my stomach. The town looked the same, a postcard of coastal charm that for me always felt claustrophobic. I pulled up to the house and the front door burst open before I'd even cut the engine. My mother Sharon rushed out, arms wide, enveloping me in a cloud of expensive perfume and superficial warmth. "Izzy, you made it. We were so worried." Behind her, a blast of distorted off-key guitar feedback erupted from the basement. Alex was practicing. "He's just so excited for the showcase," Mom cooed, already pulling me inside. The house was a flurry of party prep. My father Robert emerged from the den looking older than I remembered. He gave me a tired but affectionate hug, his flannel shirt smelling of paper and pipe tobacco. "Hey, kiddo," he murmured, his eyes kind. "Good to have you home." It was the only genuine welcome I'd get. The next day was a blur of passive-aggressive commands disguised as requests. I was tasked with hanging streamers while my mother dismissed my recent professional win. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she'd said when I mentioned the Henderson contract. "It's so sweet you have that little computer hobby." A hobby, my six-figure career, my six-figure. Meanwhile, Alex floated through the chaos, bragging to anyone who would listen about the buzz around his upcoming show, rattling off the new gear he'd bought, gear I knew, with a sickening certainty, had been purchased with the $800 I'd wired from the airport. The real sting came when I was in the bookstore itself. I noticed a visible sag in the ceiling near the biography section. "Dad, this joist looks compromised," I said, running my hand along a crack in the plaster. "You should get a contractor in, or at least let me draw up a support solution." Before he could answer, Mom swept in. "Oh, don't be silly, Isabella. Alex already has a wonderful idea for a new stage right there. It'll be so cozy for his acoustic sets." She beamed at him. My structural concern, a genuine threat to the building, was dismissed for my brother's aesthetic whim. I escaped to the stockroom under the guise of finding more tape. My cousin Maya was there, wrestling with a box of commemorative tote bags. Maya was the only one in the family who'd also left town and built her own life. She shot me a look that was equal parts pity and dark humor. "Surviving?" she asked, blowing a strand of hair out of her face. I just nodded, leaning against a tower of unsold novels. "I don't know how you do it, Izzy," she said, her voice dropping. "I'm only here for 48 hours and I want to scream. They treat you like an ATM." Her words hit me harder than Alex's smirk. It wasn't just in my head. Someone else saw it. The validation was a sharp, painful relief. "I'm just trying to help," I whispered, the excuse sounding weak even to my own ears. "Right," she said not unkindly. Just make sure you're not the only one left when the community decides to cash out. My mother sent me to the attic to find old photo albums for a display table. The attic was freezing a graveyard of forgotten furniture and my father's old dreams. I found the albums in a cedar chest, but underneath them was a metal lockbox I didn't recognize. Miller's pages. Records. Curiosity, sharp and cold, pricked at me. I knew where my father kept the spare key in an old tobacco tin. Inside the box was a file. The first document was the original loan for the bookstore dated 1995. Stamped across it in bold red ink was "Paid in full, 2015. I froze. Paid off. Years ago. So what? What had I been paying? My fingers suddenly numb dug deeper. I found a second set of papers, a second mortgage, a home equity line of credit taken out in 2021 just before the bad investment story. The reason for the loan was listed right on the application, business capitalization personal project. Tucked behind it was a carbon copy of a cashier's check made out to Echo Mountain Studios, Alex's first failed studio album, the one he'd claimed an indie label had funded. It wasn't a bad investment, it was a lie. A calculated, devastating lie. My father had leveraged their home, their legacy, to fund his Golden Boys fantasy, and when it failed, he'd quietly pass the bill to me. The $94,000 wasn't support, it was extortion. I don't know how long I sat there, the papers shaking in my hand, the air thin and cold. The sound of applause from downstairs finally jolted me. The party. I'd lost track of time. I shoved the papers back, locked the box, and went downstairs, my movements stiff, automated. The bookstore was packed. The air was hot and thick with the smell of cheap wine and my mother's perfume. Community members, friends, and neighbors were all smiling, holding glasses of champagne. I felt completely detached, like I was watching them through thick glass. My mother, radiant in a silk dress, stepped up to a small microphone by the cash register. She tapped it, and the crowd hushed. "Welcome, welcome," she said, her voice glowing. She was holding a small, elegantly wrapped box. "Before we cut the cake," she announced, her smile dazzling, "I want to give a special, heartfelt thank you to the people who are the true pillars of this store." I stood frozen by the history section, the attic's glacial cold still clinging to my skin. The festive warmth of the packed bookstore felt obscene. My mother's amplified voice sliced through the cheerful din as she tapped the microphone. "If I could have everyone's attention, thank you." Her smile was dazzling as she held up a small polished wooden box. "As you know, Miller's Pages isn't just a store, it's a community. And tonight I want to honor the true pillars of that community, the people who have given their time and their hearts to keep this dream alive." My own heart felt like a cold stone in my chest. I knew with a sickening, absolute certainty what was about to happen. She reached into the box and pulled out a beautiful, thick leather bookmark embossed with the store's oak tree logo. "First to our dear Mrs. Gable," she beamed, gesturing to the elderly woman who had worked the register for free every Saturday for as long as I could remember. "For a decade of volunteering for reading to the children and for always keeping our spirits high. We simply couldn't do it without you." The room applauded politely as Mrs. Gable, blushing, accepted the small token. "And to Mr. Henderson," Mom continued, her voice swelling with practiced gratitude, "who just last month fixed our ancient boiler on a frigid Sunday morning and refused to take a dime. That right there is the spirit of this town." Mr. Henderson accepted his bookmark with a gruff nod to another round of applause. She went on, naming a half-dozen others, each with a specific public anecdote of their non-monetary contribution. Each name, each story, was a small, precise cut, twisting the knife of the $94,000 lie. Finally, the box was empty, save for one last item. It was larger than the others, attached to a thick, braided tassel. And last, my mother said, her voice breaking with a surge of genuine theatrical emotion. She turned toward the front counter where Alex was leaning, basking in the adoration. "To my son, Alex." She paused, placing a hand over her heart as if to steady it. Whose music and spirit have brought so much new life to these old, dusty walls. Dusty walls I was paying for. He is the future of this family's legacy. He reminds us all to follow our dreams, and his passion is an inspiration to us all. She was crying now, real tears rolling down her cheeks, as she presented the grand bookmark to him like it was an Olympic medal. The crowd didn't just applaud, they cheered. Alex took the bookmark, held it high like a trophy, and shot a look directly at me through the crowd. It was a grin of pure, unadulterated triumph. And then he winked. My mother wiped her eyes, signaled to my father for the cake, and began to walk toward the back room. Her path took her directly past me. Her gaze swept over me, through me, as if I were a coat rack holding a customer's jacket, and she moved on without a flicker of recognition. No bookmark, no name, no thank you for the daughter who had kept the lights on, who had single-handedly kept the bank from seizing this very legacy she was celebrating. It wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. A public execution of my worth. I had been rendered invisible. The blood in my veins felt like ice water. I watched her laugh with Mrs. Gable, watched my father pat Alex on the back, watched the entire community celebrate a fiction. I needed air. I turned to slip out the side door, but Alex materialized in front of me, blocking my path. He was still holding his bookmark, dangling it from one finger. "Tough break he said, his voice a low, taunting drawl. His breath smelled like the party's cheap Chardonnay. His smirk was oily with contempt. "Guess wire transfers don't count as community spirit." That was it. The final brittle piece of denial shattered. The $800 for the amp. The $94,000. The fraudulent loan. The wink. The casual, vicious cruelty of his words. He wasn't just ignorant. He was a willing, gleeful participant. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. I didn't feel tears. I didn't feel rage. The churning, sick anxiety that had plagued me for years simply evaporated, sucked into a vacuum. In its place, a profound, terrifying calm settled over me. It was the clarity of a high-voltage wire humming with lethal potential. I saw him. I saw my mother, my father, this entire town with a stark, cold precision. I was not family. I was a resource, and the resource had just been declared barren. I looked at Alex, my face a mask. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sounding distant, flat. "I have a migraine." I brushed past him before he could say another word. I walked through the crowd, my back straight, the sound of the party, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the first notes of Alex tuning his guitar, fading behind me. I walked up the stairs to my childhood bedroom, the one with the faded flowered wallpaper, and shut the door. The room was silent. I walked to the desk where an old framed photograph sat. It was me at 10, sitting on my father's shoulders in the bookstore, both of us grinning. I stared at it for a long, silent moment. Then, with steady hands, I unclipped the back of the frame, slipped the photograph out, and flipped it over. The cardboard backing was smooth and blank. I picked up a pen from the desk. The ink flowed dark and immediate as I began to write. The party downstairs was a dull, rhythmic thud of bass and laughter through the floorboards, the sound of my own funeral, and I was the only one who knew it. I sat in the cold, silent time capsule of my childhood bedroom and opened my laptop. My hands were perfectly steady. The architect in me had taken over the part of my brain that sees a compromised structure not as a tragedy, but as a problem to be solved. My family was a house built on a rotted foundation: my father's lie, my mother's malignant narcissism, my brother's bottomless greed. And I, Isabella Miller, had been the single unthanked load-bearing wall holding the entire facade upright. The demolition would be precise. I logged into my Austin bank account. The interface was clean, logical, a world away from the emotional chaos downstairs. I clicked on bill pay, then recurring payments. There it was, the line item that had bled me dry for 3 years: Miller's pages, subsidy. My cursor hovered over the cancel button. I thought of my mother's dismissive wave, Alex's venomous smirk, my father's complicit silence. I clicked. A dialog box appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this payment? I clicked. Confirm. The line item vanished. The first crack in the foundation. Next, I logged into my primary credit card account. Under Account Settings, I clicked Authorized Users. Alex Miller. I remembered the desperate pleading call 2 years ago. It's just for gas and emergencies, Izzy, I swear. Just until the band takes off. His emergencies had become a monthly avalanche of new guitar pedals, designer sneakers, and bar tabs. I clicked his name. Remove user. A final prompt. This action is immediate and irreversible. Good. I confirmed it. His lifeline was cut. Then I opened my email and drafted a new message. I addressed it to the loan officer at the main credit union, the one who had handled the paperwork for Alex's van. Dear Ms. Davies, I am writing to formally inquire about the process of removing my name as co-signer from the loan on a 2020 Ford Transit VIN number XXXX. My financial relationship with the primary borrower, Alex Miller, has been terminated. I saved it to my drafts folder. I would hit send the moment I was airborne. Now for the master stroke. I opened my secure cloud drive. I created a new password-protected folder. Into it, I dragged the family support spreadsheet, its final damning total of $94,350. I uploaded the scans of the fraudulent second mortgage I'd photographed in the attic. Then I spent an hour scrolling through my text history, screenshotting every manipulative demand from my mother, every smug invoice from Alex. I compiled it all into a single meticulously organized 12-page PDF. I named the file The Miller Pages, a reckoning. It was my insurance. It was my truth. I turned back to the photograph on my desk, the image of a smiling, trusting 10-year-old on her father's shoulders. I picked up the pen and finished the note I had started on its back. It was not a plea. It was not an angry, tear-stained confession. It was an invoice. I know about the 2021 loan. I know the bookstore mortgage was already paid off. I know you all lied. The support you took for granted is now gone. I paid $94,350 to learn a lesson. I am not your rock. I am not your ATM. I am gone. Do not contact me. Isabella. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark listening as the party died, as the last car door slammed, as the house fell into the heavy silence of drunken sleep. At 4:00 a.m., I picked up my small carry-on bag. I walked downstairs. The kitchen reeked of stale wine and cake. I placed the photograph message side up directly in the center of the kitchen table, where my mother would be the first to see it when she came down for coffee. Next to it, I placed my old brass-colored house key. It made a small, final metallic sound on the butcher block. I walked out the front door, got into my rental car, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. Driving through the sleeping, picturesque town as the first pale hint of dawn bruised the horizon. I made it to the Portland airport in 2 hours. I cleared security. In the sterile anonymity of the departure lounge, I sat by the gate watching the tarmac light up in the pre-dawn gray. I took out my laptop one last time. I opened my email. I created a new message addressed to my mother, my father, and Alex. The subject line was simple. Final statement. The body was even simpler. Effective immediately, all financial support from my end has ceased. This includes the mortgage subsidy and all of Alex's personal and professional expenses. Do not contact me to discuss this. It is not a negotiation. I took one deep breath and I hit send. Then I picked up my phone. I opened my contacts. Mom, block. Dad, block. Alex, block. I powered the device off completely. The boarding call for my flight to Austin began. I stood slinging my bag over my shoulder. I walked down the jet bridge, a faceless traveler in the early morning light. As the plane climbed, accelerating with a force that pressed me back into my seat, it broke through the low, thick layer of main clouds. Brilliant, blinding sunlight flooded the cabin. And I felt it. Not guilt, not sorrow. It was a terrifying, thrilling, absolute lightness. The feeling of a 94,000-pound weight being blasted off my shoulders. I was untethered. Back in Austin, I dove into the Henderson Project with a feral-focused energy. My apartment was a sanctuary of silence, my phone blissfully quiet. For 3 days, I lived in a bubble of blueprints, coffee, and calm. I was designing a life, not just a building. I'd worked late, and the first sign of the implosion came not as a bang, but as a text from Maya, who I had pointedly not blocked. It arrived at 10 p.m. Hell of a show at the music shop today. Alex tried to buy a $600 pedal. Card declined. He apparently threw a full-on toddler tantrum yelling about how his stupid sister must have messed up the payment. The owner kicked him out. A small, grim smile touched my lips, the first domino. I replied with a simple, "Good to know," and went back to my renderings. The real explosion landed a week later. Maya called, her voice low and urgent. "Izzy, it's bad. Your mom is spinning a whole narrative. I need you to be prepared." I sat down clutching my coffee mug. "What kind of narrative?" "The concerned mother kind," Maya said, her voice dripping with disgust. "She's telling everyone, the Gables, the Hendersons, anyone who will listen at the post office, that you had a sudden and tragic mental breakdown, that you flew home, acted erratically, and then cut them all off out of spiteful paranoia. She's painting you as a cruel, unstable villain, and herself as the long-suffering, heartbroken mother." I closed my eyes. Of course. She was leveraging her decades of community goodwill, casting herself as the victim. It was brilliant in its own toxic way. "She's trying to poison the well," I said, my voice flat. "She's succeeding with the older crowd," Maya warned. "They're all shaking their heads about the ungrateful daughter in the big city." But she added a note of satisfaction in her voice. "A lot of people our age, people who've actually seen Alex live rent-free for a decade, are skeptical. I may have mentioned to a few people how much work you've been sending home. The town's dividing is Team Sharon versus Team Reality." The news that my mother had turned my private pain into public gossip into a weapon solidified the ice in my veins. The small, hopeful part of me that had booked that plane ticket was well and truly dead. The next day, Maya sent another text. "Mortgage default notice was posted on the front door. Public record. Sharon is hysterical. She's claiming you stole from them." The final offensive arrived not via text, but via certified mail. I had to sign for the thick cream-colored envelope at my building's front desk. It bore the embossed letterhead of a small law firm in my hometown. My hands were steady as I opened it. The language was archaic, designed to intimidate. It spoke of my moral and familial support obligations, of the profound emotional distress and financial damages my abrupt and malicious abandonment had caused my family. It accused me of breach of familial duty and concluded with a thinly veiled threat: if I did not immediately reinstate all financial support and enter into mediation, they would be forced to pursue all legal remedies, including a lawsuit to reclaim the funds necessary for their continued well-being. They were threatening to sue me for the money I had stopped giving them. I read the letter twice. I didn't feel the panic or guilt they were counting on. I didn't feel fear. I felt a surge of pure, cold, righteous anger. This was not the act of a grieving, heartbroken mother. This was the calculated move of a cornered predator. They hadn't just underestimated my resolve, they had underestimated my intelligence. They had brought a small-town gossip war to a legal battlefield, and they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was not the scared 16-year-old girl in the bookstore anymore. I was an architect who had just won the Henderson contract, a woman who had lawyers on retainer for her own design business. I walked over to my scanner and placed the letter on the glass. The machine whirred, capturing the absurd, threatening text in a clean PDF. I opened my email and composed a new message. I attached the scanned letter. I addressed it not to the small-town hack who'd written it, but to Sarah Jenkins, the sharp, terrifyingly competent corporate lawyer who had reviewed my Henderson contract. My email was short, the digital equivalent of a sniper's shot. Subject personal matter, harassment. Sarah, I've received this. It's time to respond. I hit send. The ball was no longer in their court. It was in mine. My lawyer Sarah responded within an hour. Her email was as sharp and clean as a steel blade. Isabella, this is a baseless, emotionally driven scare tactic. They have no legal standing. None. A familial support obligation doesn't exist in this context. Do not reply to their lawyer. We will send a formal reply from my office. But, I could almost hear her pause. You also have a unique opportunity to reclaim the narrative. Their lawyer foolishly opened a door. My advice? Draft your own response. Not an emotional one, a factual one. Send it to everyone. You don't just want to silence them, you want to make it impossible for them to ever lie about this again. Sarah's advice resonated with my architect's soul. It was time to draw the final non-negotiable property line. I spent the next 2 hours composing my counteroffensive. It wasn't a letter. It was a final report. I wrote it on my own professional letterhead, the one I used for clients. My tone was cold, clinical, and completely devoid of the daughter they thought they were bullying. I methodically refuted every claim from their lawyer's letter, referencing specific dates and statutes. I stated, the claim of financial damages is fraudulent. My support was never an obligation. It was a voluntary subsidy, which I have now terminated. The only party who has incurred financial damages is myself to the sum of $94,350 over 3 years under false pretenses. This was the moment. I attached the password-protected PDF, the Miller Pages, A Reckoning. I didn't just send this email to their small-town lawyer. I addressed it to my mother, my father, and Alex. I CC'd my grandparents. I CC'd Maya's parents, my aunt and uncle, who had always preached the sanctity of family. I was done with secret conversations and whispered half-truths. My mother had weaponized the community. I would arm the family with the truth. My final paragraph was simple. Attached, you will find a comprehensive file detailing every financial transaction, including the 2021 home equity loan taken out under false pretenses, and a selection of relevant communications. This document is password protected. The password is responsible one. Any further contact from your lawyer or from any of you outside of an official notice of the sale of the van to remove my name from the loan will be considered harassment. This is my final word on the matter. I hit send. My apartment was utterly silent. I imagined the email arriving, a digital time bomb landing in inboxes across Maine. I pictured my mother seeing the CC list and feeling the first cold prickle of panic, realizing her narrative was no longer under her control. I pictured my grandparents confused, opening the email. My aunt and uncle intrigued. I saw them downloading the file, typing in the password, responsible one. The irony was so bitter it almost tasted like freedom. And then I saw them reading. I saw my grandmother's hand fly to her mouth as she saw the spreadsheet, the endless scroll of payments. I saw my grandfather's face darken as he read the scan of the fraudulent loan, my father's signature clear as day. I saw them read my mother's texts, so different from the grieving mother facade she was performing for the town. The smear campaign didn't just stop. It imploded. The unified front of poor Sharon and Robert shattered into 1,000 pieces of recrimination. The calls I knew would be frantic, but they wouldn't be to me. They would be to each other. My aunt would call my mother, her voice sharp. Sharon, what is this? What did Robert do? And my grandparents. They wouldn't call my mother. They would call my father, their son. I pictured my father Robert, the passive conflict-averse enabler, finally trapped. There was no lie he could tell, no way he could hide when his own parents were on the phone, holding documented proof of his deception. He would have to admit it. He would have to confess to his own mother and father that he had stolen from his daughter to fund his son. The humiliation, the shame, it would be a prison of his own making. I had surgically removed my mother's power by distributing the one thing she couldn't control, the unvarnished truth. The town's gossip would turn slowly but surely as the real story began to leak not from me, but from the fractured family members themselves. My phone had been quiet for days, a peaceful, protected space. I was making coffee, the afternoon sun streaming into my Austin apartment, when it finally buzzed with a call. It was a main area code, but not a number I recognized. I watched it ring, my heart suddenly a tight fist in my chest. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text came through from the same number. It was 4 words. Isabella. It's Grandma. Please pick up. The phone rang again. My hand was shaking just slightly as I lifted it to my ear. I swiped to answer, but I didn't say anything. I just waited, listening to the static on the line 2,000 miles away. Then I heard a sound I hadn't heard in years. My grandmother, my stoic, iron-willed grandmother, was crying. Izzy, she whispered, her voice cracking. Isabella, your grandfather and I. We just read your document. We are on our way to your parents' house right now. We need to talk about this. About everything. I didn't go to Maine for the reckoning. I didn't need to. I heard about it in fractured emotional dispatches from my grandmother, and later in a more detached, satisfying summary from Maya. My grandparents, armed with the 12-page PDF printed out like a legal brief, had walked into Miller's pages and demanded a family meeting. They didn't just confront my parents, they convicted them. Maya said she'd heard the shouting from the street. My grandmother, a woman of quiet, unshakable dignity, had apparently read my mother's manipulative texts aloud, her voice ringing with contempt. She had slapped the second mortgage documents down on the counter and demanded my father explain his signature. Faced with his own parents, my father Robert, the man of passive silence, completely crumbled. He confessed everything: the lie, the theft, the years of sacrificing me to enable Alex. The fallout was nuclear. The community narrative my mother had so carefully crafted, the story of the unstable daughter, evaporated overnight. The truth leaked, as all explosive truths do, starting with my aunt and uncle, who were horrified by the documented proof. They told their friends, "It's so much worse than you know. Robert lied." The gossip network, which Sharon had wielded like a weapon, turned on her with vicious speed. The story of her public performative thank yous at the party, juxtaposed with the reality of my $94,000, painted her as a monster of hypocrisy. The Gables and Hendersons, once her loyal supporters, were suddenly cool and distant. The community she had prized above all else had seen the rot beneath the floorboards. The financial consequences were just as swift. Without my subsidy, the mortgage default was incurable. Within a month, the for sale sign went up in front of Miller's pages. The red and white sign felt like a final public admission of their failure. Maya sent me a photo of it, a stark epitaph for my childhood. With his credit card canceled and his co-signer actively hostile, Alex's bandmates, realizing their financially secure frontman was a fraud, abandoned him. He was forced to sell his precious van, the one I was still liable for, to a used car lot for a fraction of its worth. The bank, satisfied, removed my name. 2 weeks later, Maya sent me another photo: Alex in a bright red vest and a name tag stocking shelves in the dairy aisle of the local grocery store. I kept my distance, communicating only with Maya and cautiously my grandparents. Our phone calls were brief at first, strained by decades of unspoken truths, but for the first time they were honest. "We're so sorry, Isabella," my grandfather said, his voice thick. "We saw what we wanted to see. We saw the golden boy, and we ignored the one holding everything up. That's on us." They didn't ask me for anything. They didn't try to guilt me into a reconciliation. They just apologized. It was a fragile, tentative bridge, but it was built on the solid ground of truth, not the quicksand of obligation. Months passed. Spring bled into a hot Texas summer. The Henderson project was in full swing. I was on site, covered in dust and sweat, when I returned to my apartment to find a single envelope in my mailbox. It was thick, cream-colored like the lawyer's letter, but the address was handwritten in a familiar, shaky script. My father's. I held it for a long time, my heart a cold, heavy knot. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. It was a letter 2 pages handwritten on simple lined paper. It wasn't manipulative. It wasn't a plea for money or a self-pitying excuse. It was a confession. Izzy, it began his name for me, the one from my childhood. There is nothing I can say to fix what I've done. I let your mother's pride and Alex's needs swallow you whole. I was a coward. I told myself you were strong, that you could handle it because it was easier than being a father to you. I let you be the rock, and then I took a hammer to you when you wouldn't carry us anymore. The lie about the loan was mine. I was so ashamed of Alex's failure, so desperate for your mother's approval, that I stole from you. That's what it was. Theft. I am living with the shame of that every day. The store is gone. Everything is gone. I am not asking you to forgive me. I am not asking you to come home. I just wanted for once in your life for you to hear the truth from me. I read it 3 times. The tears I'd refused to shed at the party, the tears I'd held back when I'd sent the email, finally came. It was a quiet, cleansing sorrow, not for them, but for the father I should have had, the family I'd deserved. I folded the letter, placed it in a simple wooden box in my desk, and shut the drawer. It was an ending. The last heavy book in a long, sad story finally closed and put on the shelf. I wiped my face, took a deep breath, and looked at my calendar. Maya's flight was arriving tomorrow. I smiled a small, real smile. I pulled out a fresh set of guest towels, my mind already on the future, on the family I had chosen. A year later, the Texas sun beat down on my neck, but I barely felt it. I stood on the unfinished second-story balcony of the Henderson Lakeside Retreat, the breeze smelling of fresh-cut pine and sawdust. No, I called down, my voice carrying easily over the whine of the saws. The joinery on that eastern window frame needs to be tighter. I want a seamless transition to the glass. Remember? The site foreman, a burly man named Dave, looked up from the blueprints and gave me a sharp, respectful nod. You got it, boss. We'll remill it. I smiled, tapping my own rolled-up plans against my palm. This house, my house, was rising from the earth exactly as I'd envisioned it. I was no longer just an architect. I was a builder of my own reality, respected not for what I could give, but for what I could create. My life in Austin had taken on the same solid, intentional quality. The hollow spaces left by my biological family had been filled not with replacements, but with something new. Maya's visit had become a semi-annual tradition, our bond deepening from cousins into a sisterhood forged in truth. She was the family I chose, and she was the anchor of a community I had built from scratch, a mosaic of friends, fellow designers, and colleagues who gathered on my patio for barbecues, who celebrated my wins, and who had no unwritten contracts attached to their affection. It was a community where love was a two-way street, not a one-way toll road. Maya had been my only conduit to the news from Maine, and a call last month had finally closed the book for good. Well, it's official, she'd said, her voice matter-of-fact. Miller's Pages sold. The new owners, a couple from Boston, were turning it into an antique shop. I felt a small, distant pang, not of loss, but of nostalgia for the little girl who had sketched in the aisles. That girl was gone, and I didn't mourn her. My parents, she'd added, had sold the house for just enough to cover the second mortgage and their debts. They'd moved into a small, sterile condo complex by the highway. And Alex. He was still stocking shelves at the grocery store. But she'd added with a note of surprise, he'd also started giving guitar lessons to local kids on weekends. Honest work, she'd called it. A small, simple step toward a life he had to pay for himself. I felt nothing at the news. No satisfaction, no anger, just the quiet, neutral hum of a disconnected line. Tonight I had driven to the overlook at Mount Bonnell, a habit I'd formed when I needed to think. I leaned against the warm stone railing, watching the sun bleed fire and gold across the Texas sky, the Colorado River, a dark, winding ribbon below. The horizon was vast, open, and unbound. I thought of the girl who had sat in that cold attic, the girl who had defined her worth by her utility. She'd believed resilience was about how much pain you could endure, how quietly you could carry the weight. She was wrong. True resilience was having the courage to set the weight down. It was the act of drawing a line and refusing to let anyone cross it. Personal freedom wasn't just about the 2,000 miles I'd put between myself and Maine. It was about severing the invisible, unwritten contracts that had been signed in my name before I was old enough to read them. It was the realization that family is not a life sentence, but a title that must be earned. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, half expecting a late email from the Henderson site. But it was a new message from a man named Ben, a landscape architect I'd met last week. "Hey you, I'm at that little wine bar on South Congress you mentioned. Care to join first rounds on me?" I looked at the text, at the simple open-ended invitation. There was no demand, no emergency, no expectation. Just a question waiting for an answer. A genuine, unburdened smile spread across my face. A smile that reached my eyes and felt as warm as the setting sun. I looked back out at the horizon, the last sliver of sun dipping below the hills, leaving the sky a deep, promising purple. I didn't just escape my family's story. I had survived it, deconstructed it, and used the raw materials to build my own. And as I typed out my reply, I knew with the same certainty that I knew the sun would rise, that the best chapters were still to come. By choosing herself, Isabella finally closed that painful chapter, opening a new one defined by her own strength. What did you think of the line she drew? We truly read every single one of your thoughts, so leave a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more stories of clarity and consequence. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.